Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the History of Science Nights, organized by the Department of the History of Science of Istanbul Medeniyet University in Istanbul, Turkey. As you know, we invite researchers from abroad who talk about very interesting topics about their expertise. And this month, we're going to be talking about Newton, not just as a scientist, but also in a different perspective, a non-scientist Newton. So it is going to be hopefully very, very interesting. And as always, I would like to give a couple of details about how we proceed with the program. You are allowed to ask questions throughout the meeting, and your questions will be in written on the chat panel, and I will be asking those questions for you. And you don't have to wait to ask questions in the end of the meeting, but we will be directing the questions before the end of the talk. But depending on the questions, our guest might actually intervene and just answer the question right away, depending on as he please. So we had mic checks, so we can hear quite clearly. So if there's any problem, there is a possibility that it might be because of your own connection, or in case we have any connection problems, we'll actually redirect it again. But sometimes when you have your Bluetooth or any kind of connection problems, please getting out and coming back to Zoom also helps. It helps me and sometimes anyway. So please do check your connections first and then ask us questions about the problems. We will try to deal with this if it happens. Hopefully it wouldn't. Normally we do this with another co-host, Lisanna Aydin. Now this will be one exempt to it because she has her baby just a week ago. So we're going to leave her alone for a while. She's attending to listen, but she won't be co-hosting. So this all will come to me. And we start usually with a short bio. So allow me to read you that, and then we'll start with the questions to talking. Before that, welcome, Dr. Schilt. Dr. Cornelis J. Schilt, also known as Kisyan, or by his initials CJ, is a historian of early modern knowledge making at Vrije University in Brussels. He holds degrees in physics and astrophysics and history and philosophy of science from Utrecht University. And after a career in information technology, he obtained his DPhil in history of science at the University of Oxford, studying Isaac Newton's scholarly writings. He was subsequently elected a junior research fellow at Clinical College, Oxford, where he worked on Newton's career at the Royal Mint and lectured and tutored on the 17th century history of science. His current project involves a comparative study of Isaac Newton's methodologies between the various areas Newton was working in. He has been with the Oxford-based Newton project since 2013, both as a senior editor and as transcription manager. He has published and presented on all things Newton and has just published his first book, Isaac Newton, The Study of Chronology, Prophecy, History, and Method, with Amsterdam University Press, which we'll be talking about today. Aside from Newton, he is interested in the foundation of early modern science, the history of religion, and the history of scholarship. And thank you again, Dr. Cornelis Schilt, for joining us. Allow me to start with a question about the Newton project. Could you please briefly explain what is the goal of this project, and take it away, please?
Well, what's the goal of this project? That question has been asked for the past 24 years. Project started in 1998, and the answer has never been the same, I think. The project started off as the child of Robert Iliff and Scott Mandelbrot, two renowned Newton scholars now, but then rather young still and ambitious. It's the early days of the internet. All of Isaac Newton's manuscripts total about 13 million words. They are all over the world in various collections, and the project sought to bring together initially just a small amount of these writings online, open access, openly available, machine analyzable. And the first focus was on Newton's scholarly writings. Initially, they thought that was about 2 million words in total. Turns out it's more like 6 million words. And after the first grant ran out basically after 5 years, they had to apply for a new grant. And unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, and I think it's the same in most of Europe, you can't actually apply for follow-up money to do the same thing again, because you basically underestimated the number of words or the work or whatever. So every time the project had to come up with a new pitch and with a new focus, which was sometimes problematic, but eventually resulted in the project having now transcribed about 90% of all of Isaac Newton's writings.
90%.
So the scholarly and the scientific, yes. There's been European grant money as well, English grant money. The problem, of course, is when you run out of time, or basically when you run out of money, but you still have a lot of manuscripts to transcribe, and then you start with a new grant, you keep on sort of spilling over, you keep on, the backlog increases. And thank God for private donors who were interested in heritage, if you like, and in Newton, for stepping in and providing sometimes six-figure sums to continue the transcription work. And next year it will be 25 years since the project started. And the goal today would be to have everything that we know of Newton, and that is in some way available to us as a project, transcribed by 2027, which is the tercentenary of Newton's death, 300 years after Newton's death. So that's a really nice marker.
Absolutely.
The largest tranche of manuscripts still to be transcribed are at Cambridge University Library, and they consist of the so-called Macclesfield collection, papers kept by the Earl of Macclesfield, consisting of Principia-related materials and mathematical correspondence. And we're still trying to get money for that, basically.
And allow me to emphasize on the number of words. You said 13 million words. Yeah,
and it might still be too low. It might still be more. I mean, I think when the project started, Rob Eilert and Scott Mandelbrot thought that in totality, Newton probably had written about 5 million words or so. When I joined the project in 2013, they said, well, it's probably closer to 10 million words. And
it's
now
keep coming up then, yeah.
And now, because Newton's handwriting is incredibly dense, and he edits his writings all the time, there could be as much as 1,200 words on a single page. Those are large folio pages, of course, but it's very dense. It has writing throughout the margins, in between paragraphs, or even in between the lines of a single paragraph. So there's more words that you can imagine. Basically, it's very difficult to make even an educated guess about the number of words that a particular manuscript holds before you start working on it.
It's fantastic. I mean, it's always
it's problematic when you actually say, well, I'm going to transcribe, give me money to transcribe 2 million words. And then you realize that it's more like 4 million words, and no matter how hard you transcribe, you can't do it. I mean,
but at the same time, it must be scaring you too, because you assume that you finish up some of his works and you say, now I know about his works on something, and then another 12 million words comes up. You just start to have doubts that whenever we will be finishing this project. Then.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we basically know what most of Newton's manuscripts are, of course. So we have limits, if you like.
Yes.
Newton's manuscripts are auctioned off at various auctions, and some are still in private ownership. I think nowadays we can make better and better estimates of how many words are in the manuscript. So the end is near, and I think the 5-year time window that's sort of rested us now should be enough, basically. And I don't think we will ever reach the full 100% because of private ownership. But if it's 99.9%, I mean, come on. I mean, the writings are literally all over the world: United States, Cambridge, Jerusalem, Oxford, whereas Geneva, and now they are brought together in the digital realm with images hosted by Cambridge University Press and the National Library of Israel. So everything connected as it once was. one might
That's
argue.
fantastic. Yeah, that's true. As if it's its own, as you said in your book, it's his own notebook library that you can actually sit down in his chair and see what he was written. So which is fantastic idea. And this is, I think, one of the most successful projects that we can see for one person, I think, because due to his popularity, I can imagine, because so many people want to preserve his writings. But let's direct a little bit of your involvement, and which will end up with about your book. So this is the most interesting thing, because we always know about Newton, specifically in Turkey, or even in general popular idea about Sir Isaac Newton. We always talk about him as the person who changed the modern science, even actually the father of the modern science at some point. And we always talk about the scientist Newton, but this project actually created something more, and actually completely changed, revolutionized the way we can look at Newton, I imagine. And your project, your involvement with the project comes with this one. Can you take it away from that?
Yeah, I think we have to realize, indeed, I mean, Newton was first and foremost a natural philosopher or scientist. He's rightly famous for that. I mean, his most important works were in optics and mathematics, mechanics, and he is the one who introduces the mathematical turn in physics, if you like. After Newton, mathematics and physics are forever connected. Before Newton, yes, there were attempts were being made. Newton is not the sole genius here. He's not the one who invents everything. I mean, just the fact that Leibniz came up with calculus at around the same time Newton did it. The calculus that Newton, by the way, never used in the Principia, that's another story. But ever since the early 17th century, you see this mathematical movement with Descartes, with Galileo, with Kepler, of course, and various others. But you might argue that it culminates with Newton. He ties pieces together in the same sense that Einstein, what Einstein did for general and special relativity, the right person at the right time with the right insights. But then, if you'd ask Newton himself what he was primarily, he would not have called himself a mathematician, I think, nor a natural philosopher. He would have called himself a Christian, first and foremost. Yes. And he basically considered everything he did was done in the service of God and for the greater glory of God. And he considered himself elected to dig for wisdom. Newton never ever thought that anything he did was new or revolutionary. He firmly believed that all knowledge had been given to mankind at the beginning of time, that knowledge had become lost because for various reasons, but Newton would have said because of man's idolatrous practices, and he was one of the elected few to rediscover that knowledge. And it's actually quite interesting that what the word discovery means when you think of it. It literally means lifting the cover, removing a cover. There's nothing new there. It's just revealing what's already there. And Newton would have so agreed with that. So the archive, Newton's archive, for want of a better word, it reflects this Newton, because out of the, let's say, 13 million words, less than half are what we would now call science and mathematics combined. 60% at least are scholarly topics. And those include church history, general history, all sorts of Christian theology, chronology, which is ordering events in world history, literary study of alchemical treatises. So not alchemical practice, but literary copying from alchemical treatises and trying to see how they're connected. And many more of these topics that we would not sort of expect to find in Newton's archives. But the reason why we have this idea of Newton is not because of Newton, but it's because of the Enlightenment. So Newton dies in 1727, and he published very little. Newton was quite afraid of criticism, based on the responses to his first paper in 1672. So he publishes the Principia in 1687, and then after the death of Robert Hooke in early 1704, he publishes Optics, and there are multiple editions of these. And then there are, let's say, a few papers, a few works that Newton contributed to, but it's only a handful. I think by now I've published more than Newton ever published during his lifetime, which is silly, and you can't compare it. It's different.
Yeah.
But Newton was, I mean, he didn't really like publication. Yet when he died in 1727, his executors found several manuscripts that were near completion, and that were indeed published in 1728 and in 1733.
Including chronology as well, I think.
Yeah, the 1728 is the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, which is a massive work, dense work on ancient chronology. And then in 1733, a selection of his studies on the prophecies. Now, the latter work is an amalgamate made by later editors. It's all written by Newton, but it was not sort of published in any way Newton would have ever published it, because we can trace Newton's editorial interventions. The chronology was definitely more or less as Newton intended it. But already in the decade after Newton died, people began to worry that Newton would only be remembered for his science, and that his interest in scholarly topics would be reasoned away as the products of a crazy old man who suddenly turned to religion. And this is literally in a letter that was collected by Newton's executor, John Conduit, who was writing a biography of Newton that was never published, never finished. Conduit died rather soon after Newton. But fast forward to the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, this is exactly what French scholars or scientists actually like Laplace and Biot are doing. They look at, they say, well, all of the stuff, all of this stuff on the prophets in the Bible and stuff in ancient history, these are the products of an ailing old man, a man whose mind has gone hazy, and we shouldn't take it there's nothing in there. This is just ignore it.
In that sense, they didn't actually aware of the volume of the work that he has done as well.
So the manuscripts were hidden. The manuscripts were hidden in a private archive at the Earls of Portsmouth, somewhere in England, in a castle. But the books,
1930s, right? Yeah.
Well, David Brewster is Newton's earliest true biographer. In the 1820s, he already is given access to these papers. And in his 1831 and later in his 1855 biographies, he publishes excerpts from these writings. Somewhere in 1754, another work of Newton is published, which is a very critical work where Newton proves that two key passages in the Bible are forgeries. Key passages because they are inserted in manuscripts at later time to sort of retrospectively prove a particular Christian doctrine, namely that of the Trinity. And Newton there's something at stake here for Newton, because by 1690, Newton is an anti-Trinitarian. He didn't grow up to be an anti-Trinitarian, but his ideas changed. Somewhere between his 35th and his 45th year, he loses this belief in the Trinity. Of course, is the idea that God, that the Christian God consists of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, three in one, all named God. And Newton says, well, Newton doesn't believe this anymore, and moreover, he finds evidence for the fact that the manuscripts have been tampered with. We are in the early days of the higher criticism of the Bible. We only have about 100 manuscripts of various New Testament passages. These are both from the New Testament. And Newton is gathering notes from scholars all over Europe, and including his own, to show that in many of the manuscripts, the particular texts have been inserted in translations as well. And he writes this in two very long letters to John Locke, the philosopher. And Locke then asks Newton for permission to have the letters published anonymously in Amsterdam, with some very critical Christian thinkers. And Newton initially says, yeah, why not? And then soon after, he retracts his permission, because he's afraid that will come out that he's an anti-Trinitarian, because it might have cost him his job at Cambridge. He was still at Cambridge then, but also because Newton believed that, yes, you can argue about these things in a private setting, but you shouldn't publicly dispute about them. So an anonymous treatise is already quite difficult. In
May I ask a question about
yeah,
this?
of course. Oh, I can go on for ages. So come on.
Yeah. In your book, I'm jumping a little bit ahead,
Yeah,
perhaps,
yeah,
but
go,
in your
go.
book, you had the same idea about he didn't actually discuss with his contemporary chronologists, because he actually read their book but never actually talked to them, because
No.
he might have been afraid of any kind of problem that will actually causing those conversations, or even like the publications will actually get some reviews and he has to answer them. Is it, I can relate to this, because if you want to finalize some things that you realize that you won't be able to finalize in short time, you don't want to spend too much of time answering the critics. You completely finalize what you want to say, then you can actually answer with your own publication. Do you think this was his case also?
It might have been, actually. It might have been. By then he had had enough of criticism anyways. And he was doing something which went against the spirit of the times. So a bit of context, which is important here. My book is, of course, about Newton studying chronology. Chronology basically means the ordering of historical events in time. And nowadays, if you want to look at when something happened in the Assyrian history or Egyptian history, you go to whatever website, whatever book, and you can just say, all right, this happened in 724 BCE, you know, or 63 AD, because we now have a universal timeline onto which we have mapped all these histories. But in Newton's days, that wasn't yet the case. Those universal timelines were slowly emerging, and there were still very conflicting histories. Newton's days, the Bible taken as the Genesis taken as literally. So creation happened at around 4000 BCE, and very important, the flood, which is described in the Bible and probably also in the Quran as covering the entire world, happened at around 2400 BCE. This is important, so because the flood is a great reset button. After the flood, there's Noah, his wife, his 3 children, sons, and their wives, so 8 people in total, and humanity starts all over again. So you can't possibly have major civilizations before the flood that continue throughout the flood. It's impossible. Or soon after the flood, because it simply takes a couple of generations or multiple generations for the world population to expand again. But then already in 1598, a famous scholar, Scaliger, finds the King's List of Manetho, and this list is now the backbone of Egyptology. And in the list, 31 dynasties are presented, so royal families with multiple pharaohs each, who reigned over Egypt, and presumably successively, for a totality of about 5,500 years, with the last king reigning at the time of Alexander the Great in around 330 BCE. So you can see that this is problematic, and not only do those dynasties go back before the flood, they even go back before creation. And throughout the 17th century, you see scholars trying to solve these problems. Some simply ignore this King's List by Manetho. Others say it's true, so we have to work with 2 timelines, one scriptural and one, well, Scaliger called it proleptic, but he was the only one who did this. No one sort of thought this was a good solution. Others would just take only those dynasties of Manetho that fitted in between the flood and Alexander the Great, as did Bishop James Ussher, for instance. But generally, but the thing is, the King's List was too good to be false. I mean, Scaliger knew everything about forgeries, but this was the genuine thing. There were multiple witnesses, there were multiple versions of the list. Clearly, there were copies and everything, but it all looked genuine. And so at around when Newton starts working in chronology in the 1670s, 1680s, this whole idea of a universal history is in decline, because how can you write universal history when you have on the one hand the Bible, which you want to believe is true, including all its dates, and on the other hand you have things like the King's List of Manetho or the Assyrian historian Ctesias. So there is a problem. Is problematic, and so you see scholars in Newton's days no longer doing this. They just focus on, let's say, just the history of Egypt, and then not think about biblical complications. But Newton wants to return to what scholars in the 16th century did, write such a universal history, and thus he he has no one to talk to, if you like, because no one would have agreed that this was a good idea. Whom would you, I mean, Scaliger was long gone, and others were no longer interested because this was problematic. And I'm quite sure that at Cambridge, Newton had discussions with historians, but just oral discussions, of course. And the thing is, this was not just an so the second question that you might ask, and that I will ask straight away, is why the hell is Newton actually interested in this? Because Newton never did anything just because it's a nice intellectual challenge. The thing is that this whole idea of world history is connected with the future.
I see.
Newton believes that one of the greatest duties, one of the prime duties of every Christian believer, is to study the prophecies in the Bible that relate to the future.
When you say the future, you mean the end of the world?
The end of the world, yes, but you don't know when it happens.
That's true.
And Newton says basically, well, if the Jews in Jesus' time had studied the prophecies in the Old Testament, and if they'd studied them correctly, they would have understood that Jesus was the Messiah, the one they had been waiting for. But instead, they killed him because they did not recognize him for whom he was. And so he says Christians in his days should do the same. They should study the prophecies in the Old Testament and the New Testament in order to recognize Christ when he returns and to have an idea of when this will happen. Because Newton lives in a time and period when the world is in turmoil. Now, of course, the world meant just that small island up there, which is called Britain, which still think it's the center of the world. I've lived among them. I have survived. I'm a survivor. But anyway, Newton grows up in a civil war. Think of it. He literally grows up in the middle of a civil war. It happens on his doorsteps in Lincolnshire. The king is beheaded and killed, and the king is also the head of the church. So this is problematic. Restoration happens. Newton is barely at Trinity College, Cambridge, as a student. Comets appear in the sky. Hence why my book has a comet. Although this is actually the 1680 comet that Newton himself studied later. But this is 1663, 1664. Then you have an outbreak of the bubonic plague. Think COVID in Newton's days. And Newton is forced back to the countryside, so he has to sort of abandon his studies for a while, although he never really abandoned his studies. He just sat down under the apple tree and invented calculus, as the myth goes. But there is some truth in there. And then again in 1666, 666 is, of course, a figure from Book of Revelation. But in September 1666, 80% of London burns down in a massive hellish fire. This is the setting. And of course, everyone is interested in could Christ come back very soon? Because there were also calculations done, and they all pointed at a time in the 17th century. So, and Newton believes that
it's not just a scholarly interest that he's actually interested in. He's actually literally hoping to find out something that might happen quite soon then.
Well, quite soon. He wants to know, and this brings me back to the connection with history. He wants to know where on God's great timeline is the world. Where are we? Because history is something that unfolds. And there are prophecies in the Bible that basically tell one kingdom happens, then another kingdom, and then a fourth kingdom. These are the four beasts, the four kingdoms, and the fourth kingdom is then the Roman Empire, which then continues as the Holy Roman Empire with the Roman Catholic Church, which Newton thought was led by Antichrist, the Pope, and so did many other Europeans, of course, except for the Catholics for some reason, who were rather like their Pope. But the idea is that, I don't know, I don't get it. It's strange, but anyway,
go ahead.
There is this, so if you don't have a timeline onto which to map those prophecies, then you're lost. So you need to work out a proper world history. And
so
that's
he does that. He does that,
yes.
For 50 years, he works on that. But
not continuously, and not as one project. And at the start of the 50 years, he does not have this at his at his mind already.
Yeah,
because
there's a shift there.
problems. There are so many problems. I mean, so in the 1670s, when Newton is a bit burdened by naughty letters, or naughty letters is the wrong word, irritating letters, particular by Jesuits from Europe, who criticize his work on optics, he becomes very interested in these prophecies, and he's a good friend of Henry More, who's the theologian, and who's writing on this all the time. And he has discussions with Henry More, and he doesn't like what More is doing. He thinks what More is doing is way too simplistic. And so he starts his own studies of initially the prophecies in the Old Testament book of Daniel. He wants to work out what are these four empires. He wants to work out, all right, the problem is that there are three books in the Bible that detail a particular period in Jewish history. It's called the Jewish exile or the Babylonian exile. So so Israel is a kingdom. We are in about the 7th century BCE. It's split in two halves, 10 tribes and 2 tribes. 10 tribes have been taken away to Assyria already. And then there's 2 tribes in around 600 BCE are taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar II to Babylon. And they live there for about 70 years. There's a young man amongst them called Daniel, and he writes a book. It's half prophetical, half historical. And then there are 2 books, book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, which are written after the Jews have returned from captivity and built up Jerusalem and the temple and their country and everything. And these books have both sort of prophetical details and they have historical details. And Newton tries to understand the various, the sort of the genealogies of how things happened, how things evolved. And he tries to understand, for instance, what kings reigned over Babylon when. Because he doesn't yet look at Babylonian historians. He doesn't trust them. What he looks at is the Bible, and he looks at Jewish historians. So not in the Bible, but Jewish history books, like Seder Olam Rabbah, which is the great Jewish chronicle. And he first believes these chronicles, and these chronicles are a bit weird, but they are followed by Josephus, and Josephus is of course an eminent historian according to Newton, if you like, initially. Now, in those 3 books in the Bible, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, mention is made of kings Darius, kings Xerxes, kings Artaxerxes, and Cyrus the Great, of course. But I mentioned those 3, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and Darius, because we know now that in history there have been multiple Artaxerxes, there have been multiple Xerxes, and multiple Dariuses. But the Jewish chroniclers thought that every time the name Darius was mentioned, it had to refer to the same Darius.
I see. So
the same with Artaxerxes.
Timeline mix up then, yeah.
But Josephus did the same. So Flavius Josephus, this eminent Roman Jewish historian, does the same. So it's logical that Newton follows them initially, but he ends up with all sorts of contradictions because he uses this logical mind of his to work out things. He says, well, there must have been 2 Ezras, one living here and one living 200 years later. There must have been 2 Nehemiahs, and so on. And at some point he abandons this because it becomes too messy. And then he starts realizing that what those Jewish historians have actually done and what Flavius Josephus have done. And then he sort of abandons this project, and he approaches it from a different angle. He starts working on the most reliable history that he can find, despite the fact that it's completely messed up. But it's Greek history.
I see.
And then he starts using Greek history as a backbone to tag in all the other histories, if you like, and because of the interactions that there have been. And you find this interesting because he uses astronomy and astronomical data to calibrate this timeline. And the way he thinks about it is like this. So there are ancient astronomers called Thales or Hipparchus, and they make observations, and they describe the heavens. They do this in a sort of poetic flourish, like the dog star rises in the evening on that. But Newton had realized this thing called precession, namely the sky moves 1 degree in every 72 years on average, 1 year, 2 years on average. So if you then interpret the words of Thales and of Hipparchus correctly, as in the dog star rises so and so. So which meridian is this? What latitude is this, and everything. You can sort of work out when this happened, how many hundred years back this observation was made, and Newton has to make assumptions, of course, to do this. For instance, he also assumes that the asterisms are drawn on the globe at the time of the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts. So know your mythology, know your Hollywood movies on Jason and the Golden Fleece and all that sort of stuff, you know, Achilles, all the shebang.
This is the ship of Argos, right? This is the ship of Argos as well. Is it?
Yeah, this is the ship Argos. The name is Argos.
Ship Argos, that's it.
Yeah, and so it's headed by Jason, and his men are called the Argonauts after their ship.
I see.
Now, one of the Argonauts is now the name escapes me. He's described as a centaur, so half horse, half man, as we now know it. But he's also described as an astronomer. Chiron.
This is very interesting, though, because
Chiron is his name. Chiron. And Joe Newton argues that Chiron and compatriot of his, Museus, designed the globe and designed the globe as a guiding tool for Jason and the Argonauts, and then the asterisms are put thereon by Chiron because, says Newton, look what they depict. These are all elements from the story of Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah.
So this is, of course, interpretation and everything, but it is clever. It's
absolutely very interesting as well, because he's using all data he can find from the old times. I mean, not just the old times. He's trying to reduce the interpretation problems over time, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. But he's also doing things that his fellow chronologists and historians really didn't like. Another reason why he didn't discuss with them. So Newton is confronted with these lists of 50 kings who reigned for 2,000 years in total. And Newton says that's 40 years on average. That's a bit too long, isn't it? Yeah. Because here we have all the kings who reigned over England since William the Conqueror. Here we have all the kings who reigned over France. And he starts working out an average of how long a regnal reign is. And he arrives at a figure of 18 to 20 years.
Yeah.
And he also starts calculating how long a generation lasts on average. And he says 30 to 33 years. Now these figures shift over time because Newton is sometimes a bit sort of juggling with figures. He's playing, he's faking it because he wants to make his arguments fit, and they don't always fit.
So he does that then, yeah.
So he's faking it, yeah. Or he does the same in the Principia, by the way. We'll forgive him for that because because no one understood that book anyways, which is not true. That's a joke. But basically Newton is calculating averages, and then he says, all right, so let's go back to those 50 kings. They can't have reigned for 2,000 years. If the average regnal reign is, let's say, 20 years, then they must have reigned for only 1,000 years. And so he condenses all these lists. He even works,
very reasonable assumption,
He even works out a factor of 4/7, which to multiply all these lengthy reigns. And so this allows him to bring back everything in the time span allowed for by Scripture.
So the main idea here is that never changing or cannot be changed date is the date of the flood then. So that's he believes.
No, the thing is interesting because in the chronology, the book that is eventually published, he just starts around the time of Homer, which he thought lived in about the 12th century. But in between this initial project that starts with the books of Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah that he sort of abandons for a time, and the second project which starts with Greece, he does something interesting because he basically starts working on the ancient mythology stories of all the Mediterranean pantheon, so all the Mediterranean peoples. So the Latins, the Greeks, the Egyptians, they all had their own stories of a Saturn or a Jupiter, a Neptune, a Hercules. And Newton proves that all of these, or proof for himself, that all of these are basically retellings of the stories of Noah, the biblical Noah, and his sons and his grandsons and the fourth generation thereafter. And he validates this in various ways. He says there are ancient poets and historians who talk about the 4 ages of man: the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, and the iron age. And in those mythological narratives, all of these ages, they last for centuries and centuries. And Newton says, well, if the golden age is ascribed traditionally to Saturn, whom I say is Noah, and the silver age is traditionally associated to Saturn's son Jupiter, whom I say is Noah's son Ham, and so on, then all of these ages cannot have lasted for more than 1 generation.
I see.
And so he brings all of this together, all of these origin stories, condenses them massively, and thereby says, well, everything I do afterwards is founded on the principle that all major civilizations hark back to Noah and his sons. So he solves that problem without actually having to give a definitive figure for when the flood happened.
But this caused another problem, isn't it? Because he starts realizing that he needs to interpret differently the scripture that from the regular understanding that at his time, let's say.
No, not really.
No, he remains in the same then.
Yeah, I mean, he basically says, all right, with Noah, world civilization is reset, and everything else now fits in the time frame between the flood and Alexander the Great. Because he's basically shown that all the origin stories of these peoples start with Noah. So even the king's list, so for instance, take the king's list of Manito. There's 31 dynasties with 300 and something pharaohs in total. He basically says, well, first of all, let's use my 18 to 20 years average. And then secondly, that doesn't work, by the way. Then secondly, he takes up a suggestion from another scholar. He says, here we have a dynasty who reigns in Memphis. But the second dynasty, the next dynasty that's mentioned, reigns in Elephantine. The following dynasty suddenly reigns in Sais, which is another city. He says, couldn't it be that they did not reign successively, but simultaneously each over a different part of Egypt? Because there is this assumption, because there is this assumption that Egypt was always one kingdom, which we now know it isn't. We now talk about the first, second, and third period, with an intermediate period of strife and turmoil and war. So this allows him to also say, well, the king's list of Manito should be condensed much further and further and further. But mind you, he solves this problem by ignoring it. Because after those 4 generations, the first 4 generations, he does not fill in the gap. The chronology of ancient kingdom amended only begins in around 1200 BCE. So he ignores everything. He's just, maybe he felt that there were too many difficulties there. Maybe he felt that he couldn't fit it in anyway, or that he just didn't have the time. Because when he starts rewriting, so Newton is sort of composing a proto version of the chronology of ancient kingdom amended when he's already 60 years old, which is already quite old for those days. And then in an illegal translation of a summary of his work is published in France in 1725, and Newton is 83 or 82 by then. And he frantically starts rewriting most of his work and start casting it in what would eventually become the chronology of ancient kingdoms amended. But he had to be economical. He's 82 years old. And he's very
close to the end, yes.
He's old, he's fat. He's still incredibly bright, and he still doesn't need glasses. But he's also very old, and other people are taking care for him already, so maybe he felt that the end was nigh, and not, by which I didn't mean that Christ would return, but that his end,
Yeah. Well, From another point of view, what we usually talk about Newton and his science, it is clear that he has the God in his understanding always. The religious side always, shows itself with the cosmological ideas that we see God's hand in everything, and even in the mathematics, everything is related to his beliefs. We can see that. Can we say the same thing the other way around? That whenever he talks about the scriptures, yes, he talks. You mentioned he's using astronomy, but to what extent that he uses the science we know he was very good at to be able to explain things. I mean, if he could find out things, this might be controversial for him, perhaps. If he started to give him the data that may not actually agree with him about the dates, would he still uses those scientific terminology, scientific details, the values, or what kind of a relationship he would have with the scientific understanding and the scripture, or his studies on the scriptures and chronology?
I think I understand your question. I think what you see with Newton is someone who is, on the one hand, a rather orthodox believer. So he truly believes that God exists. He believes that Jesus has come and for the salvation of mankind, but he's also a very rational person.
Yes.
So this is the way he reads his Bible. At some point, when he starts doubting this idea of the Trinity, you can, from his manuscript, we can see what he is doing. He is collecting passages from the entire Bible that talk about God the Father, that talk about the Son Jesus Christ, and that talk about the Holy Spirit. And he's basically he's basically collecting evidence for or against the Trinity. And the list of texts that he finds in the Bible that suggest that the Trinity is incorrect is much longer than the list of evidence for the Trinity.
I see.
And you can basically see him weighing up these in his hands and in influencing his decision making. The same is in 1681, he gets a series of letters from a man called Thomas Burnet. Now, Thomas Burnet is also a Christian. Everyone in Newton's days was a Christian, but Thomas Burnet doubts whether the creation story in Genesis, so that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, that it really happened that way. Burnet writes to Newton and he says it can't have been that there is light on the first day when the sun and the moon are only created on the third day, and those sort of things. And he says so Burnet says to Newton, we have to use an allegorical understanding and not a literary understanding of these 6 days of creation. Now, the idea of an allegorical understanding is as old as the Christian church itself, but it was never either or. It was always allegorical and literal.
I see.
So Newton gets, we actually don't have the original letter from Burnet, the first letter, but we have Newton's reply and then Burnet returning. But from Newton's reply, we can gather what Burnet wrote, and also from the book that Burnet published subsequently, because he's asking Newton for advice on, do you agree with this? Because he comes up with this whole theory about how the earth was created by God, and it conforms to all sorts of, there's a lot of physics in there, and he wants Newton's advice on whether the physics is right. Now Newton looks at the physics and thinks, yeah, that's all right, but he says, I have an issue with you taking Genesis as purely allegorical, because he says, I see your problems, but it must have happened this way because God wrote it. And most importantly, if the days of creation were not literary days, then the seventh day of creation, the day on which God rested, was also not a literary day. Yet one of the 10 commandments, namely, thou shalt hold the Sabbath, the rest day, then he says, then God has based this command on something which is not true.
I see.
How could God have done this? So what you write here is absolutely ridiculous. So this is also Newton. You see, they're both sort of wriggling, if you like. Newton and miracles, for instance, Newton never doubted the miracles in the Bible. That was never a problem, despite the fact that they went against laws of nature. But that was never an issue for Newton. It was an issue for some of Newton's contemporaries already.
So how he did deal with, for example, one of the questions I see from Professor Julia Bray says, what did Newton do with biblical characters like Methuselah, who lived for ages? So when he sees that in the scripture, how does he deal with that?
Yeah, he's rather silent on this.
Ah, I see.
It's one of those things that he doesn't take notes. He must have had thoughts about it, but I'm trying to find out, because there are one or two snippets where Newton has some thoughts on this, but I don't think he thinks it problematic, because so Newton firmly believes that the world was perfect from the start and that it declined gradually. So creation happens, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, everything perfect. Then the fall of man. So sin enters the world, pain enters the world, death enters the world. But it's not like it went all the way from here to here immediately. So he would probably have seen this as a decline, because you see the ages of those pre-Diluvian patriarchs. You see those ages slowly decline already, and after the flood, you see them decline even further. Because I mean, Noah lives for, I think, another 900 years or so, and then further on it goes down, down, down. So Newton would have said, you see, there's an evidence we go from perfect to less perfect. And why is this? Well, it's because of the fall of man, but also because man keeps sinning. And so the world keeps on becoming less and less perfect. And you see this reflected in the ages of man. I think that would have been his answer, because it fits his understanding of the
this kind of a rationale he has. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, this is how Newton thinks, I believe.
That's very good. And this is the only way to deal with this, I think, with Newton. In your book, you mentioned that most of the people who worked on Newton perhaps before the Newton project, that piling up many things together, they always act on the publication that they have, or at least a couple of the notebooks they could actually access easily. But when you try to understand his original understanding, original ideas and goals, you have to go through all of them together.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's impossible to be able to say this is his rationale, this is his methodology. So,
absolutely, and this is what handicapped early Newton scholars. I mean, history of science as we know it now emerges in the late 19th century, but it's only from around the 1960s onwards, with the social turn, that we also understand that scientists did not live in a vacuum, that they are the products of their time and place and everything, and that they had other interests. And so with Newton, it's only in 1936 that the world learns about, that's not entirely true. So in 1936, Newton's non-scientific papers are auctioned off by the 9th Earl of Portsmouth. So the Portsmouth family has had all the Newton manuscripts ever since Newton, well, about 25 years after Newton's death, because a family member of Newton married into that family. So John Conduit is married to Newton's half-niece, Catherine Barton. They take care for Newton when he's old. All of Newton's manuscripts then come into their hands. Their daughter, also named Catherine, marries to Viscount Lymington, and in 1743 Viscount Lymington becomes the first Earl of Portsmouth. She is the sole heir of her father and mother, so she gets the papers, and then they stay in the family. So, but the 9th Earl of Portsmouth is a bit of a naughty boy. He has he marries an American, which is not done for an English lord, of course, and yes, it messy divorce. You can see there's a movie in there, messy divorce. And he just auctions off whatever Newton papers they still have. All the science stuff and mathematics stuff is already at Cambridge, but Cambridge didn't like the alchemy, they didn't like the chronology, they didn't like the theology, because that was not Newton. This is 1890s history of science. It's only the science, and only what we now call science, that's history of science. Now, believe it or not, we are in 2022, and there are still historians of science who think this way, primarily those who come from the sciences. So don't think it's gone. Don't think it's gone. Unfortunately, it's not. So 1936, massive auction. Newton's papers are given away, if you like, because they're really sold for dirt cheap, even for the times. To give you an idea, I think all of Newton's papers then, which is 7 million words in scholarly materials, were auctioned off for less than £10,000. I saw one piece of Newton manuscript, one paper, one folio, was auctioned off by Christie's in July last year for a measly £1.8 million. Yes, inflation is real, but this is a bit more than that. It's very expensive toilet paper.
So,
but anyway, sorry. Give me 1 minute, because I know I'm all over the place. But basically, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, buys all the alchemy. Avraham Shalom Yehuda, American-born Jewish scholar, buys all the chronology and theology. They exchange a few manuscripts. They pass away. They donate their materials to the National Library of Jerusalem, as it was then called, and to King's College, Cambridge, where John Maynard Keynes had studied himself. And those are the two first collections of scholarly materials of Newton that then become publicly available in the 1960s. But you would still have to go to Jerusalem, or you would still have to go to Cambridge to actually consult those manuscripts, and you would have to stare at them with your own eyes, paper by page, folio by folio. Newton's really tiny hand, Newton's horrible handwriting. So in the 80s and 90s, microfilms are being produced. And you can at least sort of zoom into those microfilms. They're really bad black and white things, if you like, or especially when they were being sort of PDF'd. But the microfilms themselves are actually quite good, to be honest. But then again, you had to have a massive microfilm reader. You had to have that rather expensive microfilm collection. So the internet, digitization, transcription. Now you can actually do full comparative research. People in the 60s, 70s, and 80s couldn't do that. They worked with 10, 12, 15 manuscripts and drew conclusions based on this very small sample, which conclusions were obviously imperfect because they work with imperfect materials and with limited materials. Sometimes because they didn't know there were other materials present, or because they thought, well, this is a representative selection. But frequently it wasn't.
It's not just the second-hand researchers, but also Newton himself, as we now know, that was working with some of the not the perfect of the historical sources that he can actually find. And in your book, you mentioned specifically he doesn't actually have the studied versions of some of the translations, and he just had some problems because of those. And in connection with this, with the 21st century that we have now, with the new scientific discoveries about the world, about the history of the world, I will ask a little bit of a controversial question, that because of you working on Newton and his methodology, is it possible to be able to say that Newton's methodology can never be worked again, should remain in the 19th century, or 17th century, 18th century, or we can actually use the same methodology to be able to construct a different Newtonian understanding of the sciences as well? So you have a book already about that.
No, let me first up something funny. So I told you that Newton is working with averages. He calculates the average length of Bracknell range and of genealogies, and he also assesses historical sources based upon sort of likelihood. If the example, if 50 kings reign for 2,000 years, that's 40 years each, that's way too long for the course of nature, as Newton would have said. This is a Mary Beard's SPQR, History of the Republic of Rome. And in it, I found an argument that goes like this. The 7 legendary kings of Rome reigned for about 290 years in total. That's more than 40 years each. That can't be correct, because we know that kings don't reign on average for so long. It's exactly Newton. I was thinking of putting it in the book. Eventually I didn't, but it's just was so interesting to see that same method for which Newton was scolded afterwards. Well, he wasn't there, he wasn't around because he was very dead when it came out. But that same method returns. It's a logical approach, if you like, to historical sources. Now, Newton, of course, went way further, you know, mathematical formulas and fractions, 4/7, and that was way too coarse, way too crude, if you like. A much more nuanced approach is necessary, but some of his methods were apparently quite valid, despite the criticisms of his contemporaries, because those contemporaries, they were old-fashioned, if you like. Now, mind you, it's terra incognita for most. People couldn't read hieroglyphics. The Rosetta Stone was not yet discovered. This only happens in 1830 something, I think. So they had to work with so many languages that they couldn't describe, that they couldn't translate, they couldn't read them. This is the early days of archaeology.
And interestingly, he only uses the Islamic sources, if I'm not mistaken, is he?
Wow, no. He uses some Persian sources.
I see, because
not Islamic sources, and he only
he only resorts to these. Go ahead, sorry.
He only resorts to these sources at the very last, when he has filled in his complete scheme already, because he really doesn't trust them.
Yeah, well, and rightly so, I think, because in the 17th century it becomes quite popular. Some of the books from the Islamic world are quite popular, and one of them is Abul Fida's history, and it was translated in John Greaves works on it, and it's not that of a good book to be able to based on anyway, so that he may have missed some of the important things, but at the same time he's not the first person who's dealing with these. I mean, I work on John Greaves specifically with Professor Julia Bray, and we started realizing that in some of the astronomical tables he copies, or at least a comment on chronology of the ancients, including flood as well. So he's actually trying to put things together. So he wasn't the first one, but at the same time, he was actually perhaps the first one to rationalize the versional explanation and put it into context and combine both scriptural history and the regular history, even Greek history at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, Newton owned a copy of Greece Pyramidographia, so he's very interested. But I was actually thinking, I think I lied to you when I said Newton, because Newton uses the historian known as Mirkon in the West, and his Arabic name is Muhammad ibn Kavancha ibn Mahmud. I probably completely butchered that. Mirkant, History of Persia. And I think he's a 16th century Arabic scholar.
Oh, I see.
I'm not entirely sure there.
I'll check it out. Yes.
Yeah. So that was a book that was translated into English and available as a source on the history of Persia, together with Ctesias, the old historian.
Okay.
I had to look it up. Yeah.
I should actually check it out as well. And Professor Gillespie says yes, that's right. So she confirms. So. Thank you very much, and let me just give the comment by Professor Gillespie. Says, thank you so much. Like most people perhaps today, I was brought up to think of the Bible as poetry, not history. It never occurred to me to wonder how long it would take to replenish the earth after the flood. Arithmetic and chronology take on a whole different meaning, not to mention prophecy. So.
Yeah, that's a very valid comment. It was actually a problem for Newton's contemporaries. This was the sort of stuff they did in the 17th century. Buchwald and Feingold, in their book on Newton and the Origin of Civilization, have written a whole chapter on the sort of population dynamics and all the calculations. It's quite fascinating because it involves sometimes quite sophisticated mathematics.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are so many arguments about this, and I think we will be discussing for dozens of years with the debates about, because what I wanted to have this, as my dear friend, that I know that you were working on this for a long time, and we need to translate this book in Turkish as soon as possible, because I always try to find the Islamic side of the stories that he works on, because when you look at it, the Quran doesn't specifically give a timeline for the flood, for example. It gives you the flood, but at the same time, you can actually shift a little bit of the dates that you can actually try to pinpoint. So that might. Exactly. Go ahead.
There's interpretations, because it's all based upon calculations and upon interpretations of he was the son. So people are being described as A was the son of B, but the words the son of can also mean A was of the offspring of B. So it could have been his grandson or much later. So there are all sorts of interpretive layers. And no one in Newton's days arrives at the same exact date for the flood.
Yeah.
So Usher is 2349, so 2349 BCE, but Scardiga arrived at a figure of at least, I think, 50 years later, so 2290 something. And Scardiga was also an eminent philologist. So there was debate about how to interpret this. There is leeway.
Certainly. So, and there's a room that you can actually work with using the same methodology, and you can imply with the new information just gives you the little bit different stretch of the history, perhaps.
You can even smuggle a pre-flood. You can even smuggle by 1200 years, if you accept not the Hebrew, the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, but the Septuagint, the Greek translation that was made allegedly in the 3rd century BCE, based upon Hebrew texts no longer extant, because the figures given to people like Methuselah and so on are different. And very frequently, when the Hebrew text as we have it now would say 30 years, the Septuagint text would say 130 years.
I see.
So if you want to play with the Bible, I know that sounds very I
mean, play in the sense that
there is leeway for calculations, but then you would have to argue why you pick one version over the other. So there were people in Newton's days, because this was known to Newton and his contemporaries. There were people in Newton's days who explicitly opted for the Septuagint to solve some chronological problems, whereas others stuck to the Masoretic text because they thought the text was much more reliable, and the Septuagint simply a really bad Greek translation.
I see. Very good. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, and I imagine that we'll be seeing so many more publications about this, and so many perhaps new projects, more small pocket projects related to different areas of what you can actually discuss now about Newton's works, both with your own work and in general with the Newton project, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Professor Julibres, I can't thank both of you now. Thank you. If there are no any more questions, we might actually finalize the wonderful talk here, I think. And I would like to say thank you again, my dear friend Kisyan. Yes, and for everyone that we will be meeting next time, and this will be on YouTube in foreseeable future. Not exactly for the date, but not too long later, hopefully. So you can actually watch it again, or you can actually say to another one, and your friends that they can watch as well, and we will actually follow up over time. That's it then. Thank you very much. Have a good night for everyone.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for attending.